My name is Chris Sorenko. I'm co-chair with Myron Rogel, who you'll see in a second, of Communities Inspired for Environmental Action. And I'm also running the IT today, so that's why I might look a little distracted at certain points. And I am also director of the Center for Faith, Reason, Peace, and Justice, which has partnered with Communities Inspired for Environmental Action to bring you this, what is in Saskatchewan, a noontime webinar. So I just like to start with the land acknowledgement for where most of the people involved with Communities Inspired for Environmental Action are located. That's on Treaty 6 territory, the homeland of the Métis and Nihayao territory. Everyone that's involved in this group is really committed to striving to work and improve the settler Indigenous relationships. And we have some ideas that have been put on pause because of COVID, so we can watch out for that in the future. So what we're going to do today is we're going to try to keep things moving, keep it entertaining for the hour. This event is part of Face for Climate Justice, a global multi-religious action. It's our effort to do a little something given the COVID situation in Saskatchewan. But it's not just a little something, because we have three engaging folks that will be sharing. We'll have a little chance for questions, and then we'll also, as part of the third sharing item, talk about a way that we can positively influence policy here in Saskatchewan in particular. If you're from outside of Saskatchewan, I think you'll still find this interesting and engaging. So our first two speakers will have the floor. There'll be Karen and Peter, who I'll introduce as each comes to speak. Then we'll have that time for questions, about 10 minutes for questions. I'd ask if you had any questions while they're speaking, if you could just type them into the chat, and I'll try to curate and combine questions, and then we'll close with that action item. So without further ado, let me present to you Karen. So Karen Fraser Gitlitz serves the Saskatoon Unitarians as their parish minister, while also studying part-time for a diploma in art therapy. She lives on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis with her partner, musician and music teacher Paul. As a treaty relative and a descendant of English, Scottish, and French settlers, Karen is learning about her responsibilities as a guest on this land. Karen expresses her belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person and our collective responsibility for social, economic, and environmental justice in both her ministry and her art making. So over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Chris. And so good to be with all of you here today. I'm very grateful to Communities Inspired for Environmental Action and St. Thomas More College's Center for Faith, Reason, Peace, and Justice for creating this event so that all of us can participate in the second Global Multi-Religious Action Days. I suspect that the community I serve is not particularly unique. We are finding this second fall of the pandemic to be trying in so many ways. Individuals and families are all in very different places. Needs vary considerably depending on our situations. And so it's particularly important, I think, to appreciate those who organize gatherings like these so we can step outside of our day-to-day and focus on our planet, our Earth. So thank you. I think one of the side benefits, I suppose you could say, of the pandemic is that it has taught us that massive changes in habitual ways of doing things are possible in ways that I probably couldn't have imagined earlier. And some of these have benefited the environment, but this has been accidental, a byproduct. It's not intentional. And at the same time as this has happened, many people have moved from an experience of security to an experience of precariousness, a feeling of threat, a concern about survival and well-being that has narrowed their focus to their immediate selves, their immediate families, and just keeping above the waters. Feelings of isolation, aloneness, and despair are very real. And I think it's important to take these into account, this situation into account, as we think about environmental action, because this is all part of our current context. And faith communities, I believe, have an important role in helping us care for one another. Faith communities are places where we can lay down our despair. I got to experience this summer a couple of communities that were experiencing climate change firsthand. And I came away from that experience with a sense of despair and concern. And I needed a place to lay that down, and was grateful for the community that heard me express my experiences. But faith communities do more than that. They remind us that we are not just isolated and alone. We are part of a larger community, existing in right relationship with one another and with all that is, however we define that. And that's going to be different in each community, of course. Some communities have created profound reflections on our environmental sustainability and our concerns about climate change. In my own tradition, we speak about interdependence. It's one of our 7 principles, and it speaks to us about our intimate connectedness with all the other beings in the place that we inhabit. I've also been moved by Pope Francis's Laudato Si, which speaks about our relatedness to the earth in terms of family. The Pope draws on images of family coming from St. Francis's canticle, and that sense of profound connectedness of the earth as our sister, the earth as a sibling, resonates with me. Ecotherapists use the language of attachment theory, which can sound dry and clinical, but it's really the same thing. It's the language of care, the language of love. And it speaks to our ability to connect to place with love. And I think that many of us, if we cast our minds into experiences in the natural world, can think of moments of connection and love. For me, this summer, I was at Grasslands National Park, a place where I experienced deep, deep connectedness to the land that I am walking upon. The challenge, I think, is to bring that connectedness into everyday life, to remember that relationship. In her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, Robin Wall Kimmerer, an enrolled member of the Potawatomi Nation and a professor of environment and forest biology, speaks of becoming naturalized to place. How do we know when we've become naturalized to place? When we are such good guests, when we have such significant offerings to our relatives, that we are viewed as helpful, as necessary, as important to our ecosystem. And so I wonder, can we be so necessary to this place that if we were to disappear, it would be a loss and not a relief? One way to move forward to this vision, I think, is to recognize the intimacy that we already have. We can recognize the waters each time we turn on the tap. We can thank the ground under our feet as we wake up and stand up. We can say hello to all the beings that live with us in this city and not just the human ones. By noticing when we turn on the light or even turn on our computers, we can remember that we are supported by the land that we live on. The land is necessary to us. Can we fashion ourselves so that we are necessary to the care of the land? Can we be generous to this place? Good guests, good siblings to the other inhabitants. Can we learn to love this land with the fixedness of purpose with which a lichen loves a rock? Can we love with the awe of a parent holding a newborn? Recently, several billionaires have been spending large amounts of money to develop space tourism. I have thoughts about this, which I will refrain from inflicting upon you in this moment, but I was struck by The man I think of as Captain Kirk, William Shatner, who when he came back down after his space journey was reflective and thoughtful. He said he looked down at our beautiful blue planet and he saw life. This earth is life. This planet, this land has shaped who we are and continues to support us so generously. Our challenge as faith communities is to learn how to shape ourselves so that we are better able to be contributing relatives, contributing citizens to this place called life. Can we be necessary to this land? Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to Peter's presentation and learning how we can be a positive influence on Saskatchewan power policies as a way of being necessary and important to this place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. So keeping things going, I'm going to introduce, also you'll notice I put a couple of links to two of the sources that Karen mentioned in the chat, Laudato Si and Braiding Sweetgrass, if you want to follow up on those. So now to introduce Peter. Peter Prebble is a member of the board of directors for the Saskatchewan Environmental Society. He's also a founding member of the first renewable power cooperative in Saskatchewan, SES Solar Co-op, which was established in 2015. Peter served as the co-op's president for his first 3 years. He also holds master's degrees from the School of Environment at the U of S, and bachelor's degrees in business administration from the university, a bachelor's degree in business administration from the University of Prince Edward Island. Peter served as a member of the Saskatchewan legislature for 16 years. For many years, he was also a community development worker and has served as the policy director for the Saskatchewan Environmental Society. In the past decade, Peter has authored several reports on climate change and on building a renewable energy future here in Saskatchewan. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks so much, Chris. And thanks to you and Myron and to Carol Chubb for the invitation to be a resource person today. And my thanks to Karen for her important presentation. I'm going to focus on how SaskPower policy needs to change in the province. SaskPower is edging in a more positive direction, but it has a long way to go. And just to put all this in context, we need to keep in mind that the United Nations is asking the international community to reduce greenhouse gas emissions 45% in the decade ahead, globally. 45% reduction by 2030, and to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050 if we are to avoid catastrophic effects from climate change. And we're already seeing very, very damaging effects from climate change, as I'm sure you all know. So in that context, SaskPower is currently aiming to be carbon neutral by 2050. Electricity generation in this province accounts for about 20% of our greenhouse gas emissions, almost 16 million tons. And provincial emissions right now are 75 million tons. So for those of you outside the province, Saskatchewan has an exceptionally high greenhouse gas pollution level for our population. It's about 3 1/3 times the Canadian average and about 9 times the world average. So we have a lot of work to do, and SaskPower is just essentially 20% of the problem that we're tackling. Now, Saskatchewan has 3 large coal-fired power stations that are owned by SaskPower. It has 10 natural gas-fired power stations. And together, those account for well over 3/4 of the electricity that is generated each year in the province. And then Saskatchewan also has 6 wind power facilities, and it also has several hydro facilities that, depending on the year, will produce anywhere from 16 to 20% of the electricity that we consume in the province. So we're roughly, with wind and hydro together, roughly about 1/4 of our electricity is coming from renewables, and the rest is coming from fossil fuels. And the task is essentially to The greenhouse gas emissions, of course, are associated with our fossil fuel facilities. So the task is, how do we replace those with carbon neutral facilities? The first thing that I would recommend is that SaskPower take up a challenge that the federal government has been urging utilities across the country to do, and that is work with neighboring utilities that are blessed with more renewable power resources than we are here.
And I muted.
We're fortunate to be next to Manitoba, and we should make use of Manitoba's hydro as a way of helping to phase out our coal-fired power in this province. So my first recommendation would be that we purchase at least 1,000 megawatts of hydro from Manitoba, enter into a long-term contractual agreement with them. They're currently selling most of their, as they develop new dams, they're selling that power to the United States. We should purchase some of that electricity here in Saskatchewan, and we should use it to help phase out our coal-fired power stations in this province. So we've got about just under 1,600 megawatts of coal-fired power. We need to get rid of it all by 2030, in my opinion. That's not SaskPower's current plan, although the federal government is pressing them to do that. If we bought 1,000 megawatts of hydro from Manitoba, we could achieve that goal very readily. We'd need to build additional transmission capacity, probably at a cost of just under $2 billion. We spent $1.5 billion on a carbon capture unit in Estevan, just for context, and we got 110 megawatts of power out of that. So spending $2 billion on transmission capacity for hydro imports from Manitoba, I think, would be a very good investment, and it would immediately eliminate a very substantial portion of our greenhouse gas emissions from SaskPower, because about 3/4 of those emissions right now are coming from coal. The other quarter are coming from natural gas. So in addition, we should invest more heavily in electricity conservation in this province. SaskPower has not followed the good practices of many utilities in the United States that have had a lot of success with electricity conservation. If you look at what California has done, for instance, even though the population of California has expanded and there's been enormous economic activity, it's one of the largest economies in the world. Its per capita use of electricity has not gone up since the mid-1970s. That's the kind of objective we should be aiming for in Saskatchewan. We're a long way from that right now, but it speaks to the fact that California invested heavily in electricity conservation. That's what we should do here. It's another term for that is demand side management. So we could easily reduce demand by 400 to 500 megawatts by very cost-effective investments in electricity efficiency and conservation. And a third area then is the development of wind and solar. To SaskPower's credit, they have plans to expand wind power in a significant way in Saskatchewan. They could go further. I think we could readily accommodate about 1,200 megawatts of wind power onto the existing SaskPower grid. So we could take wind up to about 1/4 of our total electricity generation in the province. At the present time, it's at about 5% of generating capacity. We could take that up to very safely up to 20 to 25% and maintain good grid stability. Don't think we'd want to push it past 25%. And it's important to my surprise, even though we've got the best solar regime in all of Canada, we really haven't prioritized investing in solar power. The Saskatchewan Environmental Society that I'm a board member of has been urging SaskPower to invest much more heavily in solar. Right now, SaskPower has only got plans for about 60 megawatts of solar power development with no specific timeline for hitting that target. But I think we should be looking at least 600 megawatts of solar power between now and 2030. At one facility alone in Alberta, 435 megawatts of solar power is being installed as we speak. So there's no reason why, for instance, as we phase out coal-fired power stations in this province, which are located in Estevan and in Poplar River, we could be looking at significant solar facilities in those two communities as part of replacing some of the jobs that are lost from coal. Another important way to expand solar is to reinvigorate the net metering program in Saskatchewan, which has been set back a lot by changes in SaskPower policy. If we reestablish that program and paid people the full retail price whenever they send solar electricity onto the grid, instead of paying 50% of the price as we currently do, there'd be a lot of additional investment in net metering in the province. And that's important, particularly as we move to electric vehicles in Saskatchewan. One of the things that SaskPower and the province of Saskatchewan should be doing is incentivizing the purchase of ultra fuel efficient vehicles and electric vehicles. And we don't want to run those electric vehicles on dirty coal. We want to run them on clean, renewable power sources. So we should be encouraging electric charging stations that are powered by solar. And we should be encouraging homeowners and businesses, when they're powering their electric vehicles at home, to utilize solar as a way of keeping the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the use of those vehicles as low as possible. Another important thing that we need to do in Saskatchewan is to modernize our grid and essentially make the grid more accommodating of renewable power. That's referred to as smart grid technology. And it's really important to be able to design computer systems and grid administration in such a way that you can deal with intermittent sources of renewable energy. So it's important to invest in that. SaskPower is beginning to do that. It has more work to do in that regard. We also need to invest a lot more in energy storage, because we know the wind and the sun aren't always available to us. We need to be able to store that electricity and utilize it the moment it's required. And again, that requires smart grid technology. And it also requires good storage facilities, both in terms of large batteries and in terms of making use, for instance, of a combination of hydro and wind together. We can use Lake Diefenbaker, for instance, as a storage facility for water. When the wind regime is good at our wind power facilities, and when the wind drops off, that stored water can be run at Lake Diefenbaker to power all the dams downstream. And so that's a way of using Lake Diefenbaker in effect as a battery storage facility that becomes immediately available as the wind drops off. So you use wind and hydro together. That's being done to some degree by SaskPower now. It needs to be done a lot more as we ramp up wind. We've also got salt caverns in the province that can be used for what's called compressed air storage. And as that compressed air is released, it can also turn turbines that generate electricity. So we have a number of energy storage options that we need to fully utilize in Saskatchewan. And SaskPower needs to set more ambitious targets. And in fairness to SaskPower, I think it's trying to cooperate with Canada's national plan to be carbon neutral by 2050. But if we're going to get, for instance, our transportation system electrified and running on renewable power, we can't wait for SaskPower to become carbon neutral by 2050. It needs to do that at the very latest by 2040. Keep in mind that President Joe Biden in the United States has just set the target of 2035 for all electricity generation in the US to be carbon neutral. So in that context, SaskPower's 2050 target is not ambitious, and it needs to become more ambitious. SaskPower is also right now targeting to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions 50% below where they were in 2005 by 2030. And that will require work. I was mentioning that they're currently at about 16 million tons of emissions per year at the present time. That needs to be brought down to 7.1 million tons in order to meet that 2030 target. So it's not that SaskPower isn't planning to do hard work, but that work needs to become even more ambitious if SaskPower is going to play a role in helping all the other economic sectors in the province reach carbon neutrality by 2050. And it has a major role to play in that regard. I just want to mention a couple of other key things in wrapping up that are will be of interest, particularly, I think, for those of you out of province. Our biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Saskatchewan is the oil and gas sector in the province. It accounts for just over 30% of Saskatchewan's greenhouse gas emissions. So bringing those emissions down is critical. One thing we should do is not abandon the plans that the provincial government currently has to increase oil and gas production 25% over the next 10 years. That's just counterintuitive if we're moving towards carbon neutrality by 2050. Another key thing is to greatly reduce our methane emissions from the oil and gas sector in this province. They're currently a major source of that block of oil and gas sector emissions, and we know how to virtually eliminate them. For instance, we could ban the venting of methane as oil is extracted from the ground, unless it needs to be done for safety reasons. The federal government is setting a target of reducing methane emissions 75% in the oil and gas sector by 2030. The Saskatchewan government needs to fully participate in pursuing that goal. And in fairness to the provincial government, they have begun that work and are getting some results already as a result of it that are hopeful. So, but that's a very, very important area for Saskatchewan to pursue. I'll stop there. I think I'll turn it back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Peter. We now have some time for questions, so you can keep your questions coming in. Some have been coming to me via email, some have been coming in the chat, some to me personally, some to everyone, so you can see some of those. And I'll try to ask questions that maybe I think both people might have something to say about. And maybe we'll start with this one that was the first question to everyone, and I'll change it just slightly from Jan, who's a local prominent local peace activist, and she's wondering, thinking about the city in which the three of us live, Saskatoon, and thinking of how it's become synonymous with sort of a suburban sprawl. Can you talk about the way that we're designing our communities and how that's affecting our energy use? And then maybe Karen, you could also comment on the ethics behind that from a sort of faith-inspired perspective. Maybe starting with Peter on that one.
Sure. Well, I think one of the first things we need to do, Chris, is change our building code so that we build all new homes in Saskatoon are energy efficient. The city of Saskatoon doesn't have to follow the provincial building code. It can establish its own building code regulations for energy efficiency. I think we should be targeting to have all new homes in Saskatoon carbon neutral, net zero energy homes by 2030. And we should greatly improve the existing building code over the next couple of years so that there's a kind of a transition between where we are now and net zero construction, so that people have to basically build to much higher energy efficiency standards, say starting by 2024. And we need to train our new graduates coming out of our technical schools at Sask Polytechnique to build to net zero energy efficiency standards. So a change in the code is, I think, really key. Also, we need to build all new homes so that they're solar ready and encourage new homeowners and all homeowners in the city to install solar technology as a way of reducing emissions from our electricity use. So those are two important steps that we could take. And I'd like to see the provincial government establish a provincial program encouraging home energy efficiency retrofit. We have a federal program that does that. It would be nice to mesh it with the Saskatchewan program. We're one of the few provinces in Canada that doesn't incent home energy retrofit at the provincial level.
Oh, wow, those are great ideas. Thank you, Peter. I feel that faith communities have a really important role to play. Unlike other communities in which we gather, voluntary associations where we often have kind of almost a bubble, if you will, of like-minded people. Faith communities are in a really interesting position of having a wide swath of the population within them, and people of varying political leanings, understandings of the environment, levels of concern and activism for the environment. And I think we could really be using our faith communities as a way to make some of the local changes that Peter's talking about. Many of us buy homes, rent apartments, live in condos. You know, the space in which we live, how can we get information out to people in our communities so that they're able to ask for the changes that will make a difference, and so that they know how to value those changes when they see them. I think we could be using our communities more effectively, because local is where we can make a significant difference. It's where we make decisions about where and how to shop, where and how to drive, how to get around the city. And we could be educating ourselves and our communities and encouraging ways to take action. In my own community, we have a green sanctuary team, and I've witnessed over the years how that team has had an impact deeper and deeper into the congregation. Initially, it was a small group of people who were particularly interested in this. And 5 or 6 years later, there are people who are expressing interest who 5 or 6 years ago did not express interest in the environment. So I think what we're wanting to build is a movement for social change and educated people who, when they go to vote in civic elections, are going to ask for these changes. So I think we are all called to get active and to use our networks in different ways. Thank you.
So I really, thank you, Karen. Thank you, Peter. I really like this one question that's just very brief, but I think would be an amazing exam question, actually. What does it mean to be carbon neutral? And now, so you see why I want to ask that question. So I think, there would be the technical answer, which is really important. But also what's the moral answer to that? So maybe Peter, I don't know if you feel comfortable also talking about the moral issue, but I know Karen will do a great job on that. So what does it mean to be carbon neutral? Again, we'll start with Peter in the technical sense, but also in that deeper moral sense.
Yeah, well, carbon neutrality for the globe is going to mean that whatever greenhouse gas emissions we continue to put into the air are offset by measures that sequester carbon. In other words, additional trees that we plant, additional wetlands that we restore. We basically, the reason we have to get to be carbon neutral is, for instance, with respect to carbon dioxide, its lifetime in the atmosphere is at least 100 years on average. Some of it is absorbed by trees and the oceans more rapidly, but some of it remains in the atmosphere after it's released by fossil fuel burning for over 1,000 years. So on average, its lifetime in the atmosphere is approximately 100 years. If you want to stop adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere and increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you have to reduce emissions to 1/100th of what they are now. So if you've got something that is in the atmosphere for 100 years when you release it, and you don't want to add to what's in the atmosphere, you have to bring it down to 1/100th of what it is now. With respect to nitrous oxide, the lifetime of nitrous oxide in the atmosphere, which is another big source of greenhouse gas emissions when fossil fuels are burned, is 112 years. So you have to get that down to 1/112. That's why I make the point that whatever remaining carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide we're releasing into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, we have to offset that through measures like wetlands restoration and tree planting and other technologies that are increasingly developing to absorb carbon, make sure that when carbon is sequestered, it doesn't return to the atmosphere. Carbon capture and storage, of course, is one attempt at that. There's interesting facilities in Vancouver that are capturing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turning it into cement. So that's what carbon neutrality means in a larger context. then for a homeowner, what that would mean is that you're essentially meeting all your home heating needs through renewable energy sources. And that's a big task, but one of the things that we can do immediately is make more use of solar and wind in that regard. And that's why it's so important for SaskPower to move towards renewable sources of electricity on the grid, because that means that we're being supplied by a renewable source of electricity in our own home. Then to the degree that we use natural gas, we can offset some of that, perhaps by turning to electricity that we generate in our own house through a net metering program. But one has to work really hard, and ultimately one has to get off natural gas and move to something like heat pumps for, in other words, you're drawing in energy out of the earth, both for heating and cooling your house using a heat pump that again would need to be run on renewable sources of electricity. So ultimately one needs to go off both natural gas and fossil fuels for electricity generation and for home heating. So you can see we have a big task ahead, which is why it's so important for SaskPower to lead on the electricity generation side, basically create a renewable energy grid. That's where we ultimately want to be as rapidly as possible in this province as a first key step to helping homeowners and commercial businesses and industries move toward carbon neutrality.
I think everything that Peter has just said is just a beautiful expression of relatedness. I think we're called to shift how we make decisions. If I'm about to purchase a new furnace, in the past, I might have thought about, oh, what's most efficient? What's going to save me the most money? What kind of cost? What's the lifetime of the furnace? Instead, those are all good questions to ask. But instead, I need to think about what is my place on this land, in this system. How are my actions contributing to the improvement of our environmental sustainability? And I need to have a sense of time. And I think this is where we have much to learn from Indigenous traditions, who have a different sense of the length of time, having been here much, much, much longer than us. Not just what is going to be good for me today in the life of my, in the 20 years I'm living in that space and the life of that furnace, but how am I contributing to all the generations that come after and what the impacts are going to be there. So I think we're learning a different type of relatedness, and it takes time. And that's why being in community is so important, so that we can encourage each other and raise questions and support one another in doing things in a different way. Thank you.
All right, thank you both. So I think we have time for one more question, and I want to give a question that maybe Karen can start with, and then give sort of the last word to Peter. And I'll try to. I have many questions, and I'm going to try to combine them on this sort of issue that maybe ties them together. And it's been something we've talked about a little bit already, and that's the interplay between issues like structure and policy, and the interplay between things that people can do as individuals and so maybe politicians can do, policymakers can achieve, how to influence policy, etc. This will be a good transition to what Myron is talking about. So when you think about this like major challenge of faithful use of energy, in both the religious sense and the ethical sense, what's the interplay there between changing government policy, changing the way that we organize our city so it's not car dependent suburbs, changing the way we think about options. Amongst those mentioned here were muskeg bog harvesting and nuclear power, and what we do as individuals in our home. And Karen, I'll let you start with that super easy question.
Thank you, Chris. Such great questions. I really feel that this is a time for kitchen table activism, the activism of conversations, of people gathering together and supporting themselves to make changes, supporting themselves to educate themselves. there's so many different levels upon which we can act, and we're each going to have a particular predilection for a way of engaging. Some folks are really excited about policy. Some folks fall asleep in policy presentations. Others are interested in what they can do in their particular lives. But as communities, it's important that we are drawing the connections between policies, what SaskPower does and what happens in my condo, or what happens in my home, what happens in my faith community. And it's a matter of taking the time to have the conversation. It's been hard, I think, over the last year and a half, because many of us are more often on Zoom, and there isn't the kind of, the hallway or the lobby or the street conversation in the same way. But it's these little conversations when somebody shares, oh, I'm going to buy this car, or I'm going to buy this furnace, or I'm writing this letter to SaskPower, or are you going to that presentation? That is ultimately going to make the difference. I think, there's a lot of kind of theoretical discussion about how social change happens. And I'm a fan of a really simple circle model that looks at, okay, so they're the folks who are most passionate about any particular issue. And they're going to have influence on the people who are already interested in the issue. The folks who are not interested in the issue are turned off by the people who are most passionate. So if you think of it as a series of concentric circles, you have the folks with the most passion. Then you have the people who are already interested. Then you have the people who are mildly disposed, and the people who are possibly totally neutral or against what we want to see happen. We each have a role. It's not just up to those who are most passionate, because the folks who are most passionate are only actually going to be able to influence those who are already decidedly interested. It's the people who are interested but not as passionate who will influence those who are just think, oh, this is interesting, but all these things come first. Because ultimately what we're talking about is reordering our priorities. And that means reordering how we think. And that doesn't happen easily. Faith communities have an understanding about how to talk about being in relationship. So I think we are well poised as people in faith communities to reach out and try to have these conversations, these ways of reordering habits that go way, way back to our childhood. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Karen, thanks so much for those really good comments. I just want to speak specifically to our situation in Saskatchewan. Individual example, of course, is so important. Individual action and working together through faith communities is extremely important. Ultimately, what we need to do, though, is not just transform individual actions, but in a Saskatchewan context, we need to transform policy in this province. Because unfortunately, more than 3/4 of the greenhouse gas emissions in Saskatchewan are emissions that we can't control through our day-to-day lives. We can't, for instance, establish what the regulations for the oil and gas industry are. That has to be done at the provincial level. SaskPower policy is set at a provincial level. So those are just two examples of things that require public policy. I could give you a dozen others as it relates to greenhouse gas emissions in this province. What is becoming clear around the world is that it's good public policy that ultimately drives greenhouse gas emission reduction. We've seen that in Europe, where the European Union has achieved a 20% reduction below what greenhouse gas emission levels were in 1990, and has already achieved that, and is now targeting a 55% reduction below 1990 levels. How significant is that? Our emissions in Saskatchewan are roughly about 45% above what they were in 1990. And so what the Europeans are doing is very ambitious, a 55% reduction by 2030. And they're doing that because there's a consensus that's developing between most of the political parties that needs to be done. It's the same in the UK. The UK is targeting a 68% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. The Conservatives and the Labour Party both agree that that's necessary. a Conservative government is in power in Britain right now, and that's their target. Labour is pressing them to be even more ambitious. That's the kind of consensus you need, and we don't have that in Saskatchewan right now. In fact, we don't have either of the major political parties in Saskatchewan right now proposing a really ambitious climate action plan. So there's a lot of work to do in this province in terms of urging our policymakers to make greenhouse gas emission reduction a really major priority. And that requires, of course, individuals to make climate change one of their top priorities when they're considering their vote in a provincial election. And whichever party they're associated with, they need to lobby that party to take climate action really seriously. So I'll just stop there. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Peter. Now we're gonna, and thank you also to Karen again. And now we're gonna switch over to Myron, who's gonna end for us today with an action item and also closing comments and thanks, etc. So this is the last you'll see from me. And over to you, Myron.
Okay,
Also,
well,
maybe I should introduce, I've introduced Myron at the beginning, who's co-chair of Communities Inspired for Environmental Action and also works for the Archdiocese as their social justice coordinator.
Thank you very much, Chris. So I'm going to begin just with a little bit of an overview. Peter already set the pace for us as according to what SaskPower's proposal is and what their goals are for the next few years. But SaskPower is committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions below the 2005 level, as Peter indicated, by 2030, with a further commitment to achieve net zero by 2050. So during this past spring and summer here of 2021, SaskPower engaged local stakeholders in a consultative process. So these consultations were done quite comprehensively and in many sites as well as online across the province. So they were made accessible to the public and they tried to target specific stakeholders with unique interests in the province. So I attended 2 of these. Was impressed by the variety of stakeholders present and that there was no particular solutions that were being favored. So although there is a long list of energy options being considered as a bridge, and bridge being these short-term options for energy production, which are maybe not where we want to be at some in the near future, hopefully, but those that are necessary to move us along. So there are many options being offered here in shortening that time span to achieve these goals without drastic changes to infrastructure, and SaskPower has named this, or significant disruptions, which is also a demand or an ask that they've listened to from the people of Saskatchewan to the daily lives of people here. That means there's going to be 3 primary bridge sources that are currently being considered. So the first is that Peter already spoke about, importing hydro from Manitoba. So this is has zero carbon. However, there is a bit of a mixed history too in terms of some of the not so good ways in which that power can be imported. There's also the economical side, so that cost, which Peter highlighted, about $2 billion, which is less than what we've been investing in some other areas, so relatively speaking. The second is natural gas production, which we have one of the largest supplies on the planet. However, that certainly has its downside as well that you're aware of. And the third is small modular nuclear reactors. So these are the 3 primary ones, although you will see quite a lengthy list on SaskPower's website. So though we as organizers today, we don't wish to prescribe a particular solution, we leave that discernment up to you and your own advocacy. But I would challenge you to ask serious questions about the inclusion of small modular nuclear reactors making the list, as they can be, of course, both economically and environmentally disastrous. So after reviewing the options, you may discern SaskPower or give them advice on how to access some of the other alternatives that they could be expanded so that we can get to these goals sooner. So the increase of solar power, as Peter said, there's a lot of capacity there to go up to 25%. The restoration of the net metering program, of course, which was an extremely effective program all across Saskatchewan, and really made it much more accessible to bring more people who couldn't otherwise afford some of these options into putting solar panels up on their house, for example. So you could ask the provincial government to put other incentives in, maybe around electrified vehicles. The recent move by Saskatchewan Government Insurance Corporation to charge a road fee for electric vehicles is a little bit counterintuitive in this way. So that could be one action, to ask the government to remove that fee. So there are a number of other opportunities in storage technology and energy sharing, for example. And then Peter offers further ideas such as smart grid technology and battery storage using Lake Diefenbaker would be another option. So what is also left out, and we as faith communities, and thank you, Karen, for your eloquent faith reflections today, which we can understand, which perhaps the general public doesn't have a vocabulary for, is that the resources of the earth are not limitless. And it doesn't have to be this false dichotomy of economy versus protecting the planet that we all care about and call home. So we understand as people of faith that there is an element of sacrifice in all of our faith journeys, regardless of the tradition that we come from. And that without personal and collective sacrifice, especially in the wealthier nations that have disproportionately absorbed so much of the world's resources, that without that, we won't hit these targets, which is probably one of the reasons why we keep seeing them come and go and not responding to them. And part of that too is due to that lack of political will in some of the wealthier nations. So how can you participate today? So the formal consultation part is over in these large group settings. However, SaskPower is still open to coming out to your community, doing a town hall, bringing in as much input as they can. So I'm going to share my screen now and go to the SaskPower. Oh, Chris, if you can give me that ability to share screen.
I'll do it as quick as I can.
Okay.
I wish I knew that.
No worries. Okay, so as we go on to this page, you're going to see several options. Clicking it here. Okay, so this is just the SaskPower page. Thank you, Chris, for that. And once you're on here, you can click on the little button that you see, Our Power, Our Future. And so that's going to bring you to Powering 2030. And under that pop-down menu, you can click on Help Plan Our Future. And it is here that you're going to see a bit of a history of how power has been produced in the province, what SaskPower is looking to do. And I will click on this one here for a moment to show you some of the energy options that are being considered. And if you scroll down, highlighted in blue, if you click on geothermal, for example, it's going to give you some graphs and pros and cons, so that you can evaluate for yourself what some of the best energy options might be, cost, and so forth. So if we go back to the main page there, rather where these boxes are, you can click on what we've heard from you. So here you don't necessarily see an in-depth breakdown of what the consultations brought in. That has been emailed out to some of the stakeholders. But you do see here recognized tensions exist around the use of nuclear power. So again, with the consultations I entered into this summer, there was quite a diverse group of stakeholders who vocalized an opposition to that form of bridge power being used to bring down our greenhouse gases and achieve net zero at some point in 2050. So that's a little bit about itself. The survey itself is right below that, of course. This is done through SurveyMonkey, so you'll find there's not a lot of space to leave comments, so you may need to send a separate email to SaskPower. But if you do have a group in your faith community that you want to bring together, there's other options for that on the page where you can invite SaskPower to come out. It can be a community town hall, a neighborhood association. There's many options there. So I ask you to please challenge you to accept this challenge and to contact SaskPower and to have them come out to seek consultation from your community while this is still open. So before closing today, I just wanted to share a little bit more from this past week. We heard the Wichita when the Aboriginal and Indigenous Engagement Conference happened here in Saskatoon, and Dr. Elder Don Crushane spoke there. And he spoke in the relational language that many of us are familiar with in our faith traditions. And he spoke of how the earth itself, the earth is something that calls us into relationship, as Karen said earlier, acknowledging our brothers and sisters who are present in really all of nature. And it is that relationship to creation that is really brings us into the fullness of our humanity. So without that, we're each suffering from some deficiencies, and what we're being called to do through days like today and the hundreds of others, maybe thousands, we don't know yet, but certainly hundreds of other events happening around the planet with, again, hundreds of others, different denominations and faith backgrounds on this global day of climate faith action, is to really re-enter into that restorative relationship with creation as a whole. So going to close here and just to thanking Peter once again for your for sharing all of your wisdom with us and some of the practical learning that we all need to take on, the vocabulary that we need to further advance this challenge that we have to care for the beautiful creation that we have been blessed with, and for Karen for putting those comments into relationship that we understand so well in our faith community. So also again like to thank Chris and especially Carol Chubb and other members of our planning community who made this day possible. So we're going to close there for the day. And I ask you, if you do have any upcoming events, perhaps quickly put those into the chat and we can make sure that those get into the recording and people can find out about those in the near future. Otherwise, if you do want to be on our contact list, you could also put your email into the chat and we can make sure that if you're not already on there, that you can receive upcoming emails about future events. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your day.